Suppose you are at a set dinner table. You are able to see and perceive the different components, such as the plate, utensils, napkin, and the glass. Now suppose that someone asks you, what's that object to the left of the plate? You can see this metal object with its sharp prongs and long handle. This is your primary utensil. Having all of this information, you try to answer the question, but ultimately cannot verbally name that object as a fork. You may mistake it for a spoon or a knife, or you may not even say anything at all. If you're an expert in fine dining, you might be able to call that utensil a fork, but this would not be due to its appearance, but your prior knowledge that the fork goes on the left, on top of the napkin. This is associative agnosia, a partial or total inability to name objects and perceived visual stimuli. Broadly, agnosias are some degree of impairment with processing some kind of sensory information. Associative agnosia is one type of visual agnosia. Patients with associative agnosia can still see and draw copies of objects with intact visual functioning. Patients can also perceive objects for what they are and the functions they serve. Despite these traits, they cannot actually name the object in question. For example, an expo marker may be mistakenly referred to as a Sharpie. Associative agnosia is not to be confused with aperceptive agnosia, which is another type of visual agnosia. While associative agnosia refers specifically to naming visual stimuli, aperceptive agnosia is a complete inability to distinguish any visual stimuli at all. They cannot name, draw, recognize, or distinguish between visualized objects. The earliest documented cases of visual agnosia date back to the late 1880s, with German psychologist Heinrich Lissauer seeing patients with object recognition problems. From this, he suggested that his patients had brain damage separate from vision-oriented areas, and was the first psychologist to distinguish the multiple types of visual agnosia, including associative. Anatomically, associative agnosia is linked with damage to the ventral visual stream. This is usually responsible for processing and recognizing visual info. This stream begins in the primary visual cortex, located in the occipital lobe, where basic visual recognition of colors, shapes, and other attributes are processed. This information is then passed to higher visual processing areas in the temporal lobe, such as the lateral occipital cortex. Brain damage in agnosic patients occurs in several areas. These include the fusiform gyrus and the white matter surrounding it. Further, in most cases, the lingual gyrus, also associated with vision processing, is lesioned, potentially impairing object recognition. Such brain damage disrupts connections between visual processing areas and semantic memory cortices, further explaining difficulties in object recognition. Associative agnosia is a fascinating neuropsychological phenomenon, and careful research continues to be conducted. A wide variety of brain regions are implicated in associative agnosia. Consequently, the growing level of understanding on the subject continues to revolutionize treatment options and, more broadly, neuroscience as a whole.